Let's
All
do
right,
it.
let me click the go live button. Well, hello and welcome to today's program. I'm Jonathan McClatchy. It's been a while since I did a live stream, but we're back this evening with two special guests. One is a girl called Overprotected Atheist, who is an atheist vlogger, has a YouTube channel, which go and subscribe to. And she, in her videos there, talks about some of the reasons why she came to reject Christianity. She herself is an ex-Christian. And we also are joined tonight by Justin Head, who is a good friend of mine. I've known him for several months. He is a college student and is we got connected through my website several months ago. Some of you know that I host a ministry for Christians that are trying to work out the answers to some of their faith questions and their doubts. And so Justin and I met through that forum, and he's very interested in exploring the evidence for and against Christianity and trying to reach an objective conclusion. So thanks both of you for coming on the program today. Justin, do you want to, let's start with you perhaps. Do you want to say just a few words about who you are, a little bit about your background?
Yeah, totally. So I'm a college student at the University of Arizona, and I became a Christian in my senior year of high school. I'm in my junior year of college now, so it's been a few years. And it was kind of just coasting on feelings for a little bit. And then I started asking some serious questions about my faith, first with some doctrinal issues, kind of looking at Protestantism versus Catholicism. And then this past May, it kind of finally just hit me of, hey, why am I a Christian at all? Like, what are the reasons for what we believe? So that's what got me to deep dive. I got connected with Jonathan shortly after. And now I'm just trying to read everything I can and try and teach myself to think right about these things and hopefully reach a true conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go over to Tiffany. Let's go over to Overprotected Atheist then. And do you want to tell us a little bit about your backstory and some of the stuff that you've been doing on your YouTube channel, perhaps what led you to deconstruct your faith and what that journey has been like for you?
Okay. Yeah, I'm Overprotected Atheist, and I do have a YouTube channel now. I've only been doing it for a year, but yeah, so I was raised basically from birth in the church, and we started out Nazarene, and then we ended up going to Assembly of God when I was a little bit older, probably like 4 or 5. I was still like young enough to like know that there was a difference, but at the same time, like it didn't make as big of a difference because like I just it was all Christianity, so or Protestantism. But yeah, I was raised in the church, and then when I was like 27 or 28 years old, my husband ended up leaving the church, and I got this brilliant idea that I was going to convert him back, and went on a search for truth and just finding, those evidence to back up my belief. And I guess it kind of turned into like figuring out why I believed what I had believed, because I had been raised in it, and it was something that I had always thought the people above me had always done all their research and stuff. It was more like I'm following, my parents and my pastors and stuff, because these are people who have been big influences in my life. And I trust that they had done their research and had looked into that kind of stuff and had actually, deep dived into it. So when I actually started like deep diving into that kind of stuff, it was, I started with a lot of the apologetics, and I was like, oh, I got this in the bag. Everything's good. I know what I'm talking about. I read a lot of like Lee Strobel and stuff, and I was like, I had like whole notebooks full of just like evidence to show my husband and bring him back. And then he's like, none of this really works. Like, you need to go look at the other side of the argument before you like come to me with, the evidence that you had. So then I started digging into other stuff, and I got into like Bart Ehrman and there's so many. I read a lot of books. I read like Seth Andrews' Deconverted and Dan Barker's Godless. And after I read those, I was just like in shock of all the things that I had really like not known about in the world. And that's kind of like where I got my name, because I always felt like I was super overprotected and put in this bubble of, this is your Christian life and you can't look at anything outside of the Bible. So, and once I did, like, I realized that there's a lot of things I didn't even know about the world that are true. And it just got me into, diving into more things in depth, not just like my religion, but everything, science and history and all of that, because it really opened up a door for me to let my curiosity free and to really look into those things. So, and then last January, I started a channel on YouTube about, walking away from the faith and the things that I have learned on through that whole process. And, just how, because I've gone through that process, it's given me more ability to be curious and to not keep myself so enclosed in the bubble that I have been in for most of my life. So.
So what was your experience coming out as an atheist like, in terms of your church friends and other acquaintances and family members and so forth? How did they receive you coming out as an atheist?
It was kind of mixed. It was since a lot of my family and friends were like Christian, it was, I think, difficult for them to kind of understand where I was and where my husband was when we decided to leave. But I don't know, at the same time, it kind of just showed them a little bit more that I could have a little bit more freedom in my life. And, I had made this decision on my own and nobody had really forced it upon me. Like, this was something that I took the time to actually look into and things like that. But I think there's still that little bit of hope, like in those Christian circles, that one day I will just have an epiphany and come back. But but yeah, I think the most difficult thing was like losing that community, because that was a big thing that I talk about on like channels and stuff that I go on, is just that community and that the way people, see each other every week and get to hang out and really have that deep connection. That kind of all got lost once I stopped going to church, and all those friends kind of just scattered. So, and, they always said like, oh, we're never going to leave you. We have, lots of friends who aren't Christian, but it's very different when you're like in that circle of people. And then it's like, oh, you have different beliefs, so we're just not going to be around you as much anymore. So that's pretty much what happened.
And what was the journey like in terms of you exploring the arguments pro and con in relation to Christianity? Did you go to anyone with your questions and doubts and ask them, what's the evidence? Why should I believe this? Or what books were you reading in that journey?
I did read, I was trying to remember the first book I read. I think one of the first books I read was Seth Andrews' Deconverted, because I started watching his podcasts and stuff on YouTube. And I also started watching like the Atheist Experience and stuff with my husband, just to like see, the different arguments and things like that. Cause I had never really heard the arguments before. Cause like I said, I had been raised in this bubble. So to me, like, there were no arguments, because like, this is truth. And people just, they left the church because they want to sin, or they don't want to respect God or whatever. But once I started like looking into those and, reading those books and seeing that a lot of that evidence that I had been told was there, really, it didn't quite exist in the way that I thought it existed, where it was like tangible evidence, that a lot more of it was on the faith aspect. And for me, that wasn't something I had ever really considered, because for me, I'd always been told, well, this is truth. And so for me, it was not about, faith. It was like, I believed that these people looked into the evidence that the Bible's true. And we have all these things that back it up and tell us that, certain science and stuff just don't have the evidence they need to back up what they believe. And when I actually looked into like evolution and things like that, I was legitimately shook, because I had been raised a fundamentalist, and, fundamentalism is all about like, if Adam and Eve don't exist, like, there's no reason for Christ to come. So once that like stuck in my head and I really looked into it, and I was like, oh, we really do have evidence that like evolution is a true thing. The dominoes kind of started falling, because it was like, oh, well, if Adam and Eve weren't real, then that whole story about, them falling and sin and all the things that happened and the reason that Jesus had to come to undo what they had done kind of all just fell apart. So I think that was like the most shocking thing to me, was that I had been so protected from those things, and it really made everything just fall apart in the end. When, I don't know, I guess some people could say I could have gone to progressive Christianity, but for me, because I was raised fundamentalist, it was like all or nothing. So
So in terms of investigating the arguments for Christianity, so you talked about Seth Andrews and the atheist experience and so forth. And what about books that actually put forward a case for Christianity? Were you able to read any of those during your deconversion experience? Or
yeah, I read a lot of, I think I had like 3 books by Lee Strobel that I read. I read The Case for Christ was the first one I read. And then I think I started like The Case for, I don't know if it's The Creator. It was like the science-y, mathy one. Yeah. And that one was a little bit more difficult because like I'm not a
Case for the Creator.
Science and math person. And I mean, it was interesting, but at the same like time, it was a little bit more difficult for me to read because I'm more of like, I like religion and history and things like that, as opposed to like math and science. So, and then I read like The Case for Faith too. So I read those 3. I'm trying to think what else. I know I used to just go to the library and get whatever books I could get my hands on so I could see both sides of the argument. But
Justin, do you have any questions for Overprotected Atheist? I know you've also had some of her videos.
Yeah, I just want to sympathize right off the bat with kind of that shock you felt in looking around to the people around you and being like, oh, wow, we're not as informed as I thought we were, I think especially for me being like a younger person in the church, I was surrounded by mentors. I was surrounded by people older than me and things like that. So when I started asking these questions, and it became abundantly clear, like that most of the people I was surrounded by hadn't thought about this or hadn't really put their positions up to scrutiny. It was a shock for me. Like it was definitely like despair. Changed a lot of my social habits and stuff like that. So I just want to like sympathize with that. One thing that I was interested in your story that you were talking about was you talked about watching the atheist experience with your husband. And I was just kind of curious about like I guess just the emotional factor of moving through these different stages of deconversion. Like I'm sure there were just a lot of really hard nights of encountering arguments you'd never seen for the first time, or not really knowing where to go from there. And I'd love to maybe hear more about that, because I think that's something that's not really talked about a lot with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's not something you ever think is going to happen. Like, like I didn't go into this going, oh, I'm going to be an atheist when I come out of this, but it really hit me hard. Like when he told me he was an atheist and he wasn't going to go to church anymore, because it's like we had 2 young kids, and I honestly believed wholeheartedly like that Christianity was the truth. So I spent nights like crying to sleep because I wanted so badly for him to come back, because I honestly believed he was going to hell. And that's a hard thing to like deal with, to be like, oh, there's this person I love so freaking much, and he could be going to hell just because, he asked some questions and stepped away from the church. And so it was hard for a little bit, because I kind of went into that whole like Christian double down thing, where it was like I was reading Christian books and I was like turning worship music on and just like praising in my house. And for a while, like he told me, like when all that was happening, he's like, I was really close to just walking out the door because I couldn't handle just the extremeness that I kind of went to, where it was like, I need to lean on God even more. But after a while, like after I started like actually looking into the other side and stuff too, I guess I kind of saw his point, but at the same time, I was still trying to hold on to what I had been taught all my life and what I honestly believed for a long time. And that's not something that is easy to just let go of. Like, even if you're even if there's facts staring you in the face going, well, this is probably not true, but you just, it's a grieving process, because you really have to go through those stages of grief of realizing that what you were told and what you believed could possibly not be truth, and that your reality could be completely different than what you thought it was. But yeah, over time, having those conversations and really diving into it and looking into it, and even like other Christians and stuff too, like I would talk to my friends and things, and I know a lot of them had doubts and things going through their minds at the same time, but they kind of doubled down too, and ended up like being part of ministries and stuff in their churches, while I was kind of heading the opposite way, where it was like, if this is true, then I really need to make sure that it's true, and not just, go along with the motions or just believe it because everyone's telling me it's true. And I think for me, because I'm a parent, that was a huge thing too, because it was like, I need my kids to be in truth. Like, if Christianity is true, then they need to be in the church. But if it's not true, then I don't want to be intellectually dishonest to them and be like, well, Christianity is true, but evolution's also true. And for me, like, that's a difficult thing to deal with, because like, I know at the end of the day, they're going to have to make their own decision when it comes to religion. But at the same time, like, you want to make sure that you're being honest with yourself and being honest with the people around you, as opposed to just following the crowd or doing what other people around you are doing because that's what you've been taught your whole life. So
yeah, wow. I was like close to crying. Yeah, that is so tough. And that kind of pressure you described of like, you just kind of want to keep going to what you're in. There's been a lot of times I've kind of caught myself in my questioning thing where I kind of want that easy out, so I do like respect you not like giving into that, Wow.
Yeah, so I was curious whether you looked into like the historical arguments for Jesus and the resurrection and that kind of thing. I saw in your video, one of your videos, the one where you were responding to Alyssa Childers, you talked about that you were kind of on the fence in regards to the historicity of Jesus and between historicism and mythicism. Have you looked much into that debate and the arguments pro and con?
I mean, I've seen other people like talk about it and look into it, but I guess for me, like, from my point of view, it doesn't really matter if Jesus existed or not, because for me, like, because I looked into other evidences in the Bible, I don't think the Bible is 100% truth. So for me, like, the argument of historical versus mythicism is not a big deal in my mind, because it doesn't matter if he existed or not, because the Bible itself has a lot of inconsistencies and things that don't line up with the reality that we live in. So, and I think that's hard for some people to understand, because they're like, oh, why don't you pick a side? And it's like, because I literally don't have enough information to pick a side. And I think, I mean, I have looked into both sides of the argument, and I can see where both sides have good, backings for why they believe what they believe. But for me, at the end of the day, like, if the Bible isn't true, then for me, it doesn't matter if Jesus was real or not, because in the end, like, if he was a person, he was a person, but I don't believe he was who they say he was in the Bible. So
sure.
And I guess that's just my thing. So
sure. So I mean, so my view on the historical Jesus is that the historical evidence for Jesus existing is pretty spectacular, quite overwhelming. We have, for instance, the Apostle Paul, who was personally acquainted with Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, and Jesus' brother, James. And so that is pretty good evidence that Paul was a contemporary eyewitness to one of Jesus' family members and Jesus' closest friend. We have the book of Acts that was written by a traveling companion of Paul who met the other disciple. He met the disciples in Acts 21. He's present with Paul when he meets with the Jerusalem church, and all the elders are present there, including James. And we have the Gospels, which I think are demonstrably, substantially trustworthy and scrupulous testimony that is based in the testimony of credible eyewitnesses. And so that, and especially the way that the Gospels and the Book of Acts intersect with each other, as well as with extra biblical secular sources in very incidental and undesigned ways. So are you familiar, for example, with the feature of undesigned coincidences in the Gospels? Have you come across that idea?
I have not come across that idea. No.
Sure, that's okay. I mean, the idea of an undesigned coincidence is basically when you have two accounts which intersect with each other in a manner that's surprising if one is dependent upon the other, or both are coming from a common source, or the story is simply being made up. So an example of that would be in the feeding of the 5,000 narrative in John chapter 6, in verse 5, we read that Jesus turns to Philip to ask, where do we send people to buy bread? And that raises an actual question in the mind of the audience. Why Philip in particular? Philip's a fairly minor character in the Gospels. You turn over 6 chapters later to a completely different context, different Passover feast, where there's some Greeks at the Feast of Passover who wanted to speak to Jesus, and they came to Philip, and it just has in parenthesis, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and he asked him, sir, we wish to see Jesus. So we have this very incidental, off-the-cuff, casual comment that Philip was from the town of Bethsaida. Now, if you go over to Luke's account in Luke chapter 9, which is the parallel of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, we have Jesus, it doesn't mention Philip in that context at all. It just mentions Jesus speaking to the disciples. But it does mention, incidentally, that the feeding of the 5,000 event took place in the town of Bethsaida. So you put the pieces together, and then we have a cogent, complete explanation for why Jesus might turn to Philip in John 6:5, because Philip's a local guy. He knows where the shops are to buy bread. But that's something which is never explicitly spelled out for the reader. One has to do the detective work of looking at Luke 9 and John 6 and John 12 and putting the pieces together. And that sort of phenomenon is very surprising on a work of fiction, but not at all surprising on a work of history. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. So basically, the way that I would approach arguing for the gospel reliability is to build a cumulative argument from that sort of feature, as well as other internal hallmarks of truth, and then also looking at how the gospels relate to extra biblical secular sources. So, for instance, Josephus often sheds a lot of light on what's going on in the gospel accounts. For instance, in Mark 6, you have John the Baptist, who is imprisoned by Herod, and he's subsequently executed. And according to Josephus tells us that, so we know from the Gospels, by the way, in Mark chapter 6, that the reason Herod Antipas had John the Baptist put in prison was because of John the Baptist's complaints against Herod Antipas having married his brother Philip's ex-wife, Herodias. And so this actually, we know from Josephus, resulted in a border war between Herod Antipas and his former father-in-law, Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans, because Herod's previous wife had gone back home to her father, Aretas, and this has caused a war between Herod and Aretas. And Herod actually loses that war. And according to Josephus, there was this rumor that was circulating that the reason Herod lost the war was actually God's judgment because of the way he treated John the Baptist. But Josephus gives a completely different explanation for why John the Baptist was put in prison by Herod. It was because of, according to Josephus, Herod's suspicious temper and his fear of an uprising. And of course, these reasons are compatible. But it's striking then that the rumor that was circulating, according to Josephus, was that Herod's armies were destroyed because of Herod's execution of John the Baptist, which we know from the Gospels was the very it was John the Baptist's complaints against Aretas, against Herod's adulterous relationship with Herodias, which resulted in him being put in prison in the first place. And that adulterous relationship was the very thing that caused the war with Aretas. And so the pieces actually fit together or explain or illuminate each other in a very casual and undesigned or incidental way that, in my assessment at least, tends to support that this is indeed historical reportage. Does that make sense in principle?
Yeah, it makes sense.
So any comments or thoughts on that style of approaching the text?
I guess for me, the biggest thing is like because there's other things in the Bible that aren't true, then I'm not going to just believe that the Bible is true. And that's the biggest problem, is like, you can have historical things within a book that can be true, but they can also have things in that book that are completely untrue and are myth. And we have seen that in other, writings from that time, where they can have history and myth mixed in a way that it looks like it's historical and myth mixed, but at the same time, and it goes a lot with that culture too, is because that culture was very different from the culture that we live in even now, and how they saw things in a very different way than we saw things. And they wrote things down in a very different way than we write things, because we think about history like in our like generations and stuff, like history is like people write down exactly what happened when it happened, versus back then where, a lot of it was oral tradition and they passed it down through time and through speaking and things like that. But a lot of it is not, it does not line up with reality that we know happened during some of those things. And that's my biggest issue, is that there are things in the Bible that just 100% do not line up with history that we know of. And one of the big things that I talk about is like Jesus's birth, is because we have a lot of historical records that completely, make that story tell us that it's just not true, that it's very much a made up myth in order to create Jesus to be something that the people in Matthew and Luke really wanted Jesus to be. It was an agenda set up to make Jesus the Messiah, when in reality, if Jesus even existed, he did not fulfill the prophecies that were told about the Messiah from the Jewish perspective. And that's a big thing that I looked into too, was like the Jewish perspective of the Messiah versus, the Christian perspective of the Messiah. Because for me, like, Jesus is the Christian Messiah. He's not the Jewish Messiah, because I've talked to a lot of like different people within, my group of people that I really talk to around, and have looked into like what the Jews actually believed about the Messiah. And that was one thing coming out of Christianity too, was that what the Jews believed about the Messiah does not line up with what Christians believe about the Messiah. And so for me, a lot of the prophecies and things that are told straight up about Jesus just aren't prophecies at all. They're very much out of context Bible verses made to create this story around Jesus to make him into the Christian Messiah, when in reality, the Jewish Messiah is supposed to bring the Jews back to Jerusalem. He's supposed to be a king, forever. He's supposed to have an heir on the throne. Like, he's supposed to die and have someone who, takes his place when he goes. And I think a lot of Christians just don't even know like what the Jews actually believed about the Messiah. And that was a big thing for me too, was like looking into those things and going, the things that I'm told about the Jewish Messiah in church are not what the Jews actually believed about the Messiah, and they don't line up. And so for me, like, yes, you can have historical context within the Bible, but that doesn't mean the entire Bible is true. And it doesn't mean that every single thing written down is true. And so for me, like, yes, there can be certain historical events that happened, but it doesn't prove that, the miracles and all the God things and all of these supernatural things that we can't prove happened actually happened. So.
Sure. Just a brief comment, and then I'll turn over to Justin to see if he has any thoughts on any of that. So I completely agree with you that that demonstrating one or two mundane matters in the Gospels does not entail that all details of the Gospels are true. Completely agree with that. I would argue that one can build a cumulative argument from numerous examples spanning multiple categories of evidence that the Gospels and Acts are written by individuals who are well informed, they're close up to the facts, and they are scrupulous, habitually trustworthy. And that being the case, then although it doesn't entail, if we can demonstrate these mundane matters, it doesn't entail that the miraculous aspects of the text are true. Nonetheless, when it comes to, say, the resurrection narratives, for example, we have to treat those, I think, as reflecting eyewitness testimony, because if the Gospels and Acts are based on eyewitness testimony, then the Gospels enact the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, and including their claims concerning the nature and variety of the post-resurrection appearances, most likely reflects the testimony of those eyewitnesses. And then that is what we need to explain when it comes to evaluating the evidence pertaining to the resurrection. So when we look at the resurrection claims in the Gospels, they are polymodal or multi-sensory in nature, involving multiple sensory modes, not just individual sightings, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. There are long discourses with Jesus, it's extended, of course, a 40-day time period, and so forth. And that's the sort of thing that's very difficult to be honestly wrong about. And then you look at the circumstances into which Christianity was birthed, and you find that the apostles, those that claim to be eyewitnesses, were willing to suffer labors and dangers and toils and hardships and persecutions on account of their testimony that Jesus was raised from the dead. And that is evidence that tends to confirm that they were sincere in holding that belief. And so by reducing the plausibility of them being honestly mistaken and the plausibility of them being deceivers, that in turn increases the likelihood that in fact Jesus indeed rose from the dead. Does that make sense? Or would you have any pushback on that?
I think I tend to lean more towards the idea that the gospel's only really true, and even Paul's things, testimonies and things like that. From what I've seen, the only people that I know for sure claim to have seen Jesus were Peter and Paul. We don't have any evidence that any of the other people actually saw them. It was more of, these two people we know for sure claim to have seen Jesus resurrected. But then we get into the whole idea that there were 12 others who claim to have seen him, but we don't have the names of those, and we don't have any evidence that any of them, came up and said oh, we saw them. It was always Peter or Paul who said that they had seen Jesus. So that's a big thing for me. And one of the other things was the 500, because we don't have evidence of who these people were and where they came from and why they claim to have seen Jesus. Because I feel if you really wanted good evidence, you would have those people at least name some of those people, so you can be oh yeah, I went back and we talked to this person and they actually said they had seen him. And a lot of the post resurrection appearances for me I think a lot of them were grief appearances. I think for Peter, especially since he was so close to Jesus, it makes sense that he would have kind of PTSD after going through that experience and really thinking that Jesus was going to be the Messiah, and then realizing that, oh no, he failed because he got put on the cross and was killed. So yeah, and I do believe that grief experiences happen. I have one from my childhood. My dad passed away when I was 15, and my mom claims that she saw his ghost around our house the first week that he passed away. And we know that our brains, when we're in grief, tend to not always process things correctly because we're grieving and we're trying to understand what is happening and why these things actually happen. And so for me, I don't believe that the appearances of Jesus were physical, or that they were real to certain people. I think that it is very highly likely that they were from people who were grieving because they knew Jesus and they really were struggling with that. And I think with Peter, that was a big thing for him, was I need to process this and be able to understand why this happened. And from my experiences in life and from my not seeing very much of the supernatural other than what other people have said to me, I think that very much goes into the idea that our brains do malfunction when we're having stressful periods in our life. And I think that is what happened to Peter, is that he had those stressful things. And yeah, he could have definitely thought that he saw Jesus, but at the same time, lots of people claim that they've seen people after they're dead. And for me as an atheist, I know for me, there's nothing after death, and people are experiencing what they best can experience while they're still here and trying to go through that grief process. So
yeah, I think it's hard to explain the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters by postulating grief hallucinations. And this is the approach that Dale Allison takes, is to argue that the appearances were resultant from these sort of grief hallucinations. And he gives examples in his book on the resurrection of grief hallucinations that people have experienced. But when we look at the Gospels, I don't think that that really cuts it, because you find it's very difficult to explain, for example, the long discourses with Jesus, such as the disciples when they wrote to Emmaus, or to the 12, or having breakfast with Jesus, or it's being extended across a 40-day time period and then immediately cutting off without any further appearances reported following that, with the exception of Paul, although his was qualitatively different from the other resurrection encounters. Yeah, although it's a popular explanation that's offered by many atheist others, I'm not persuaded by it. Does that make sense? Why I might be reserved about that explanation?
Yeah, I guess everyone can have their own opinions on it, but I don't know. I guess for me, it doesn't seem like there's so many other explanations that can come before that. But the grief thing, definitely, because I've had experiences with that. Like, I didn't see the ghosts, but someone close to me did. So for me, yeah, that is something that can happen. And it doesn't mean that it was real. It just means that was something that someone was experiencing because of the trauma that they were going through.
Justin is just reconnected. I think he was having a little bit of internet trouble. You're back. Good. You're muted. I know that you missed a little bit there, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to make any comments on what you'd heard, because I'd spoken quite a bit. Are you still there? Okay, we lost Justin again, I think. So let's go then to the issue of the prophecies. And you said that that Jesus didn't fulfill prophecies, or the New Testament authors claim Jesus fulfilled prophecies that he didn't. Do you have specific examples in mind in regards to this?
I'm not gonna rack my brain of all the stuff I know. I gotta think of. I know the ones where they were talking about okay, so Jesus's birth, there was one where they were claiming that he had to be born in Bethlehem. But that wasn't the original prophecy. The original prophecy was talking about the time of King Ahaz and how this baby was going to be born during the time of King Ahaz in order to fulfill the promise during that time, and how somehow that got changed into a prophecy about Jesus being born in Bethlehem. And that's why the authors of Matthew and Luke found different ways to get him to Bethlehem, which is also an interesting concept, because in my Christmas video that I just made last month, I talked about the differences of how they got them to Bethlehem, because one of them says that they lived in Bethlehem already, so they didn't have to travel and they didn't have to go there and actually register, because they were already living in Bethlehem. But then the other version says that he lived in Nazareth with his parents, and then when they traveled, they had to travel because of the census, and then they had to be in Bethlehem for the census, and then they went back to Nazareth. So just those two verses in general, you can see how they butt heads, because they both find a way to get Jesus into Bethlehem, but at the same time, neither one of them really have a good way to do it. So they're either just there, or they have to make up this census that we know historically did not happen. So because we know that the whole Roman world, there was no census. There was no time, any point in history, where there was a census for the entire Roman world. And they even said to the point where, even if there had been a census at that time, Nazareth wouldn't have been a part of it anyway. So the biggest thing was they were creating this myth in order to make Jesus fulfill a prophecy that wasn't even, for him. It was for King Ahaz during his time. So.
Sure. I have stuff to say about that, but I want to let Justin get it to speak. So,
sorry guys, I don't know why my computer decided to try and shut me down. Just kind of two quick notes I had. I don't want to jump back too far and derail where the conversation was at. But one thing that I thought was interesting was your talk of kind of Jews' beliefs on what the Messiah should be versus what Christianity portrays him as. And I'm not too familiar with this, but I think my only pushback was that I think Christianity almost embraces that Jesus wasn't the Messiah that was expected. It's why, like, again and again, you have these Jews. It's why they crucified him, right? He was definitely not what they were expecting. And then even in the Christian narrative, like you hop into the epistles, one of the main things that Paul has to explain, and one of the big reasons in Acts he even acknowledges is like a stumbling block, is this crucifixion, is this Messiah that doesn't fit the traditional narrative. So I think, I don't know too much of the details, but just kind of keeping it high level, I would refrain from putting too much weight on Jesus not being the Messiah that the Jews were expecting, considering Christianity embraces that pretty early on. And my other thing was just in talking about the reliability of the Gospels, is just to acknowledge how interconnected these issues are. We don't really analyze the Gospels in a vacuum. We come to it with our own prior probabilities of, say, miracle claims, or background historical knowledge, the reliability of other sources, or things like that. So I think just before trying to rely on, I guess, like a smoking gun, it's making sure we're not making assumptions that we haven't justified yet. Now, that's not at all what I'm saying you're doing. I think it's just recognizing the difference that, say, Jonathan and I would have on the probability of a miracle versus maybe an atheistic perspective on the Gospels. Because if your worldview already has you committed to no miracles possible because there's no God, it doesn't matter what evidence is going to come up in a Gospel account. That could be the most robust historical source we have. And a worldview still can't accommodate a miracle. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So we can jump back. Those are just two things I wanted to add in the middle of my computer catching on fire.
Oh, no.
hopefully that's hyperbole.
Yeah.
But in regards to the issue of Bethlehem and the Matthew and Luke supposedly getting Jesus to Bethlehem in two different ways. So the argument is that in Matthew, if you just read Matthew on its own, you would get the impression that Bethlehem is Joseph, Mary, and Jesus's hometown. The Magi are said to visit Jesus in the house, for example, and there's no reference to the journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Whereas if you read Luke's account, the impression you would get is that they start off in Nazareth and then they move to Bethlehem at the time of the census. And the census was ordered by the decree of Caesar Augustus that the world be registered in preparation for a taxation. And so everyone is called to return each to their hometown. Now, in regards to the point about the census not being over the whole Roman Empire, what I would say there is I think that the world there in Luke 2, the NIV, by the way, is very unhelpful because it inserts the word Roman where actually it doesn't exist. But I think that the world there is probably the world of Judea. In fact, Luke, the same author, uses that very same expression in Acts 11, verse 28. When he speaks about Agabus, who prophesied that a famine would come over the whole world. And then the disciples send relief, monetary aid to the saints living in the Judea region. And we know from Josephus that famine was severe over at the world of Judea. So we know that Luke uses that expression elsewhere to refer to the world of Judea rather than the Roman Empire. So that's at least a plausible interpretation. As for, you can still ask, of course, why the census was ordered by Caesar Augustus when Judea was under the jurisdiction of Herod the Great. And what I would say there is that this is plausibly explained by the fact that around the year, I think it was 80 BC 7, there was a falling out between Caesar Augustus and Herod the Great, because Herod the Great had allegedly sent his army upon the Arabians and had laid waste to Arabia. And there was a report of this delivered to Caesar by a guy called Silius, who said that Herod had done this without Caesar's go ahead. And so Caesar writes to Herod sharply, saying, "I've previously used you as my friend, now I'll use you as my subject." And he gets demoted from the rank of Rex Socius to Rex Amicus and loses the right to conduct his own taxing. In fact, everyone in Judea has to swear an oath of allegiance to Caesar. And so that's one possible explanation there. In regards to Bethlehem versus Nazareth, I think a very plausible harmonization there is that Bethlehem was actually Joseph's hometown, and he had family members, family in the Bethlehem region. In fact, we know that Mary had family in the Judean hill country, so that plausibly could be how they met. And if Joseph and Mary were in Nazareth at the time of their betrothal, it's possible, very plausible, I think, that they planned to relocate to Bethlehem following their marriage, which would then harmonize quite plausibly both Matthew and Luke's account. Does that sound like a sufficient harmonization to you? Or
a little bit, but at the same time, there are other problems with both of those.
Well, sure, but
not just, I mean, just, yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of issues with that, and a lot of issues with, I guess, trying to harmonize those things when it could have been, I mean, for an inerrant word of God to be inerrant, it would be more, I guess for me, if the Bible's inerrant, then there should have been a better way to produce it and to make it inerrant, as opposed to, say, you know, one person says it this way, one person says it that way, and then we have to have people explain it to us, as opposed to if there's this omniscient God who knows everything, and you know, he's going to know what it's going to take to tell skeptics and people that are struggling with that kind of stuff, like straightforward what needs to be told in order for that to be true. And the problem with the Bible is that a lot of those things you have to explain, and a lot of people have to find ways to make them compatible, as opposed to if God really wanted people to see, you know, that he was God, that he was this perfect, omniscient being, then he would find a better way to convey that message than in a book that is very flawed and has very problematic things in it like that, and even has contradictions to the point where, like, even when we were talking about Jesus's birth, like the contradictions that go with, you know, them saying that he either stayed in Bethlehem or he fled to Egypt. I mean, if he fled to Egypt for 3 years instead of staying in Jerusalem and being presented in the temple, like those are very different very different ideas, and they don't work together, because he wouldn't have fled and then come back so soon, because it says they fled to Egypt, and then in the other one it says they just went straight to the temple and then went home. So you can't have both of those things work. And I mean, yes, there are, you know, these ways that you can talk about it and make it sound like you can weave them together. But the problem is, if they should have been weaved together in the first place, so that it would make more of a straight line narrative, so that people aren't over here trying to understand what God's really trying to tell them, and for them to really understand. I mean, if God really wants everyone in the world to be saved, why did he do it in such a way that is just so difficult for people to understand, and makes it so difficult for skeptics to, you know, reconcile those differences and be like, why are these things so different? And I know a lot of, like, the Christians that I have talked to, a lot of it is like, oh, well, you know, because it was written by flawed men and they, you know, were just inspired, so not everything is going to be 100% perfect. But for me, like, that is just a big red flag in my mind, that if it wasn't this perfect book that God wanted it in the first place, then why in the world was it even produced? You know, it goes along with a lot of the other holy books that are out there, where it's like people claim these books are true, but there's not a lot of backing for them. And you have to take it on that whole narrative of faith, because you're always trying to weave these stories into a way that works to make your narrative work, as opposed to looking into the narratives separately and going, oh, no, these people were mistaken or they were wrong. And this wasn't God inspired. These were stories made up by humans who knew nothing about certain things that we know today, because they didn't have, science and technology and history and all those things that we have now. So for me, that's the biggest red flag, is that the Bible to me is no different than any other holy book, because there's so many issues within it. And I can go out and do the same thing with any other books. I know, like, growing up, I was very interested in, like, the Book of Mormon, and I would tear that thing apart, like, in high school, because I wanted to, see what the different things are that they believed and how they came to the conclusion that what they believed was true. And when I did that for my own faith, I realized very quickly that a lot of it was based on faith and really the words of man, and men trying to make these narratives fit what they wanted it to fit, as opposed to, God said, don't do this, do this, I am God. There's enough evidence in this book to show that, when the opposite is really true, because a lot of the stuff in the Bible isn't straightforward, and a lot of it doesn't line up with what we know about, science and technology and all these other things that we know happened in the reality that we live in. So
Justin, did you have any comments or thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, so I had a few thoughts. I think in coming to understand, like, the reliability of the Gospels, I think it's really easy, and I come from a pretty fundamentalist understanding before this as well. I think it's really easy to kind of take, if I encounter something difficult in the Gospels, or even across a couple of the Gospels, and just say, oh, well, the Bible as a whole, I have this expectation that the Bible is, like, word for word inspired by God. So this just doesn't fit that. I think instead of throwing Christianity out as a whole, or maybe throwing out even the historical Jesus, I think a simpler solution is to maybe recheck my understanding of the inspiration of Scripture. Because if we're looking at contradictions in the Gospels, or supposed contradictions in the Gospels, I don't think the Gospels need to be divinely inspired in order to trust them. Like, I trust the Antiquities of the Jews from Josephus, but I don't think it's divinely inspired. And I don't think all the other historical records we trust, we don't think they're divinely inspired. So if we get rid of sort of this Bible baggage we have in fundamentalism of this really brittle understanding, and we just come to the Gospels as the historical documents and the eyewitness accounts that, I guess I know that's a mixed thing, but we can say that they're written from an understanding of an eyewitness, like, it's people saw these things and were conveying them. So then I think when we come to that understanding of, okay, this is a historical document, what do we make of it? Coming to things like the census, for instance, how we don't have, how you were talking about, we don't have any historical corroboration of that. I don't think it's unheard of to expect a piece of information to only come up in one historical source. I don't think that necessarily means we throw out the whole record because we say, oh, this one fact isn't coming up in any other historical sources, because there are a lot of explanations we could have from the culture of the time, or just the historical record of maybe why we don't have that written down. But I would also argue in terms of the Gospels that even in the worst case of, let's say this was a misunderstanding of there not being a census, or there being a confusion on the timeline or something like that, I think we just need to be careful of not immediately disqualifying everything in that and saying, okay, maybe there is an error, a good faith error in the gospel account, which I'm not saying there is, but if there is, does that mean that they are not still reliable in the cumulative case for Christianity? So I think that's just my thought, is going from a kind of a murky area into the Gospels and suddenly going, Christianity is bunk because the Bible doesn't fit my understanding of inspiration. That's that same understanding that I've had, by the way. So I sympathize with that a lot. So I think those were just my thoughts.
What do you think, Overprotected Atheist?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess for me, like, looking at truth is truth to me. Like, if something is true, then it's gonna have stuff to back it up. And I guess for me, when it comes to the Bible,
I like that. Preach. Yeah.
When it comes to the Bible, I don't find the evidence that is necessary to back it up and to make it true. I mean, Peter and Paul can sit there and say that they saw Jesus and that they really honestly believed it was Jesus. And, I can say that I understand that that is what they believed, but that does not mean what they believed is, truth. We know that the brain is something that definitely can confuse us sometimes, and we don't always understand everything. And from my perspective, like, them saying Jesus is no different than Joseph Smith going out into the woods and seeing God in Jesus when he came to them and said, don't pray to anyone else, don't go to any other churches. Like, you need to set up your own church because all the churches on the planet have been corrupted. It's no different, because they're both stories about, people seeing, these beings and really truly believing that those beings were real and that what they were told was real. And I know I know a lot about Joseph Smith and how he was like a con and stuff, but I'm just saying there's legitimately people who have had those experiences and believe they're real, but might not understand that, like, there are people who have hallucinations, there are people who have epilepsy, there are people who have all kinds of, diseases and things in their brains that they don't understand, and they don't know what is actually happening. And so for me, regardless of what miracle or who they said they saw or whatever, there's not enough evidence to back up that what they saw is any different than what Joseph Smith saw in those woods. It's the same type of thing. And it's the same thing when you look at like Islam, where, Muhammad claims that, he had one-on-one talks with God and things like that. There's no difference when it comes to these people, because they're all claiming that this is what they saw and this is what they believe. And I mean, you either have to believe that every single person who said they've seen, an angel or a demon or a god or whatever is true, or you have to just not believe any of it, because in the end, if you're believing one religion, you have to believe in all of them, because the supernatural is not just going to be, you can't prove that the supernatural is all one thing, because there's no way to really prove that and to show that, supernatural things come from the same place. We can't say like, oh, we know all ghosts and demons and angels all come from God, because you don't have proof that God even exists in the first place. You have to start with that whole idea of like, well, if God exists, which God exists, and why does he exist, and where did he come from? And there's just it's a whole mess of stuff that you just have to unravel as you're going through that and really diving into it. And that's the big thing with faith too, is that faith is very much believing things that you can't see and you don't have evidence for. And faith can be given to anybody, anyone can believe any faith on anything. What it comes down to is you need to look at the evidence.
I've seen you mention this on your channel, and I think that the way that I would define faith, and I think the way that faith has been historically defined in the context of Christianity, is that that faith is based on evidence. It's an evidence-based trust. The amount of faith that is justified for a proposition should directly correlate with the amount of evidence that you have available to you. So I wouldn't say it's proper to talk about a belief requiring faith. It's whether faith is justified in that proposition. So if there's a proposition that I think is well evidenced, then I'm going to exercise more faith in that proposition than I would in a proposition that I think is less well evidenced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't think that's the way in which most Christians define faith. And I think that's a huge issue too, is that Christians define faith as things. I mean, it says right there in the Bible, faith is believing in things that are unseen. I mean, the book says it. So, I mean, you are literally putting all your trust in the idea that there are things that can't be proven and can't be seen.
So real quick, on Hebrews 11:1, which you just quoted, says faith is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. And if you look at the context, what is actually saying there is quite the opposite. It's saying that faith is trusting God with his future as yet unrealized promises in view of his past faithfulness. And this past faithfulness, of course, is the evidence on which we are to base our trust. And you see this hall of fame in Hebrews 11 of the Old Testament saints and the faith that they exercised and how it was grounded in the evidence that they had before them of God's faithfulness in their experience. And that then gave them confidence in God fulfilling his future promises. In the same way that someone on their wedding day trusts their spouse to fulfill their wedding vows, not because they've seen them perform the wedding vows already, it's still future, but because of their past experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I would I'd love to jump in with that too, just because I think that even if we did try and take that verse and have it mean this sort of blind belief and that being the definition of faith, I just don't think that even matches up with what Jesus demonstrates in the Gospels. We have when John the Baptist is doubting, even though he's seen the dove of the Holy Spirit descend on Jesus, he's still doubting. And Jesus doesn't tell him, oh, just have faith. When John sends his followers from prison, Jesus uses the scriptures that John was already familiar with and says, well, tell him what you've seen here. So he gives him evidence in that moment. He doesn't tell him to just have blind faith. He gives him evidence and says, hey, like, this isn't usual. You know, we have the blind seeing, we have the deaf hearing. And then even when you hop into Acts in the early church, we have these miracles accompanied by the apostles, and that's how they're demonstrating their power and their uniqueness among other, other preachers of the time. But even looking at when Paul brings the gospel to the Bereans, and the first thing they do is they hop into the Old Testament and they make sure, hey, does this match up? He praises them for that. So I don't think this idea of faith as being this almost blind, absent-minded belief matches up with the scriptural example we have of people coming to believe in Jesus being the Messiah.
What do you think, Overprotected Atheist? Any comments?
Sorry, I keep forgetting to end it with a question. Sorry, I don't mean to stare blankly.
Just go. I think for me, a lot of it was because I was raised fundamentalist, and they very much kind of pushed into you that it was blind faith, that you didn't need evidence to back up that God existed, that you only had to believe that Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. And that was basically all you needed in order to believe it. They don't go back and really look at the other evidence in the Bible and whether, the Bible lines up with, what we know about science and reality, and how supernatural claims don't really line up with what we know in reality to happen. And I guess for me, that was, I don't know, it was kind of pushed on me that, yeah, even though there are things that, there are historical things in the Bible. I'm not saying it's not, not a historical book. There are historical things in the Bible, but like I said before, there are also things that we can't prove, and there's no way to go back and look at those things and really say, oh, this really happened. So for me, a big part of that is just the idea that at least the faith pushed on me was that you had to believe it, regardless if it made sense or not, because this is what, truth is. And it doesn't matter what the outside world says, because this is what we believe is truth. And I think that was a huge blow to me too when I came out of the church, because it was like, I feel like a lot of people did put their faith in this book that they didn't know anything about other than what they're told in church every Sunday. And, even going back to that whole idea of like evolution, I went to a fundamentalist church. I'd say probably like 98 to 100% of those people completely deny that evolution even exists, because it would completely destroy their worldview and the narrative in which, God created humans as, this special creation, and that without that and without the fall, there would be no reason for Jesus to come. And so for me, that was a big deal too, is like people are going to push their agenda on what they want that outcome to be, even though there might be evidence for other things that have happened in the world. And because I'm not a progressive Christian, like I don't 100% like understand the whole like accepting evolution and still accepting the Bible. Because for me, it was, like I said, it was all or nothing, because the whole story was that if that happened, there was no Adam and Eve, and there was no reason for any of this to happen. But yeah, I guess that's just a big thing for me, is that I think faith was very much pushed in, you know, if you have questions and we can't answer them, just have faith. And that was kind of a big deal within the church. It's like, there are certain things you ask and there are certain things you don't ask. And if you step outside of that boundary, then they just, I don't know. I don't know if it was a way to just keep people from having conversations and really diving deep into those things, or they just didn't want to deal with, you know, certain things that they didn't understand.
I totally, like, I relate so much to what you just said, that frustration of looking at the church and seeing this kind of anti-questioning. And it's been a big thing in my questioning thing, of realizing that hasn't been the widespread attitude, or that hasn't been like the 100% consistent attitude either today or historically in the Christian church. So that I would just say like 100% amen, like those problems with church culture. And like, I hate that that's what you experienced, honestly, that like your questions were suppressed. Cause that's something I'm experiencing now, like in my questioning, you know, I've had some relationships like fizzle out just because there's kind of that intimidation there, you know? And I think a lot of that does come from what you talked about earlier in the call, of a lot of people not having those reasons, or really truth seeking and forming their beliefs. So when you're a comfortable Christian, this has been working for you, you know, and someone's coming along and their presence poses that threat. I think it sucks. Honestly, I think it super sucks. And I hate that happened to you. So I want to second that. Yeah, that is a real problem with church culture. And it's something I have to do every day to try and realize that, like, I'm not following Christians. I'm not following the anti-question Christians, some of them that I've been around. At the end of the day, it's Jesus, and it's are the claims about him true, you know, regardless of how ugly the church has been, even in my personal experience with questions, or even things like church abuse, you know, like it's just hard. It's hard looking at it, especially if this is supposed to be like God's holy place. But I think the Christian narrative embraces right off the bat, like, hey, people suck, but I'm still going to do something crazy here, you know? So I'd motivate you to maybe just think about that relationship and trying to look past some of the really harsh elements of church culture that I think you and I both experienced.
And by the way, on the subject of evolution, my PhD is actually in biology, and I'm actually very skeptical of evolution. I don't think that it is supported by the scientific evidence. So I personally don't feel a need to harmonize Christianity with at least the naturalistic form of evolution, because I just don't think that it's supported by the scientific evidence. For instance, I think that evolution has a real challenge explaining irreducibly complex machines that we find in the cell, such as DNA replication, or the bacterial flagellar system, or bacterial cell division, and a whole host of many systems that we find in the cell, where you have this higher level objective that's being accomplished by multiple subfunctions that have to work together in concert to fulfill that higher level objective. And that seems to me to be something that is not particularly surprising given the hypothesis of design, but is wildly surprising given the falsity of design, and therefore it tends to point in the direction of the design hypothesis. Does that make sense, or would you push back on that?
Yeah, I'm not a huge science person, so but
Amen.
From the things that I have read and seen, like I was told, you know, evolution, it changes over time. And, you know, growing up, I was taught evolution was, you know, you're a monkey and then you're a person the next day. It wasn't like, you know, it was like this instant thing. And, you know, I grew up watching like Kirk Cameron and Bray Comfort and their Crocoduck and like those kind of things, where they were talking about, you know, just absurdities in evolution and showing just how ignorant they were of the subject in general. And it just made me like realize how ignorant I was of that subject, because I wasn't allowed to learn evolution and I wasn't allowed to look into those things. And but I have looked into a lot of that stuff. There's two like big YouTubers that I really like watching for the evolution stuff. It's Stated Clearly and Gutsick Gibson. And they're both really good about like talking about, you know, basically the tree of life and how things split off, and you know, those little changes over time and things like that that have happened. And there's I can't remember the book. Seth Andrews had a lady on one time who actually had a book on intelligent design, and how it just like our bodies are not intelligently designed, because they were talking about a lot of the issues that the human body has because of the way that we've evolved over time, and just the different things that make it almost comical to say that we're intelligently designed, because we have so many issues with our bodies and so many things that just don't work and things like that. I mean, I think about when I was 14, like I had my appendix taken out because like that was something that my body didn't really need, and it was just causing problems. So we have like those kind of things where we know there are definitely things that could have been made in a better way and definitely make more sense when it comes to the evolutionary process. And, you know, there's reasons that we have, you know, leftover body parts that we don't use anymore. So for me, I definitely have seen, you know, the progression over time and how those things have changed, and how, you know, we came from that tree of life basically. And, but for me, that very much shows me that like the biblical story of Adam and Eve, I don't believe actually happened. And I don't think, and because of that, I don't think there's any reason for the Bible. I don't think there's any reason for the gospel message, because if Jesus was supposed to come, you know, to undo what Adam and Eve did, then there's no reason for us to believe that Jesus came and did that, because Adam and Eve didn't exist. Like there's evolutionary evidence from what I have seen that we have evolved over time into what we have become, and we are part of the great apes. And I know some people don't like to think that, because I think a lot of humans want to say we're like these special creatures that God created, and they want to set themselves apart as something other than, you know, the animal kingdom. But at the end of the day, like we have proof that the animal kingdom, like we're a part of it. So that's a big thing for me. And I don't know like a whole lot about evolution. I'm still learning, because, you know, I lost all those years in high school and junior high and all that because I was in private Christian school. But
yeah, I mean, I don't think that the scientific evidence actually particularly conflicts with the idea of a robust historical Adam and Eve. I would distinguish, by the way, between the pattern and process in regards to evolutionary theory. So the idea of natural selection and chance variation, of course, Darwin didn't know what mutations were at the time. That idea was Darwin's fundamental contribution to biology. The idea of common descent was not new with Darwin, right? You can trace that back to the ancient Greeks. And so even demonstrating the proposition of descent with modification or hereditary continuity, I think doesn't necessarily entail that Darwin was correct, that you can explain away the appearance of design without recourse to an actual designer. These are two separate questions. One is the pattern and one is the sufficiency of the process. And in my view, a much more defensible argument can be made for the pattern of common descent. I think that there's an argument that can be made there, and is quite a reasonable argument. The argument, in my opinion, as a scientist, I think that natural selection and genetic mutation are demonstrably insufficient to explain the complexity and, in particular, the designoid features of living organisms. And once you start, and of course, I think that the fossil record also documents saltations, where you see these explosive appearances of different forms of animal life in the history of life. Most famous of those, of course, being the Cambrian explosion around 530 million years ago, where in a very narrow window of geological time, but 5 or 10 million years, you have most of the animal body plans, the phyla, appear very, very abruptly. And there's our genus Homo seems to have emerged very, very explosively as well. And there's many other examples in the history of life that one could discuss. So once you start to move away from the naturalistic view of evolution and embrace a more teleological view, and once you move away from that gradualistic paradigm that is entrenched in Darwinian thinking, I think that the boundary between special creation and common descent starts to become rather less well defined, because you could imagine, for instance, God or designer creating new forms of life using elements of previous organisms as a template for the synthesis of new forms of life. And I think that is a plausible view, which is consistent with the data, and even suggested by the fact that you see these explosions of new forms, rapid diversification in the history of life, which suggests that at points in the history of life, God has infused novel information into the biosphere. And I think that many of the features that we observe in organisms, in particular the information-bearing properties of DNA and RNA and the irreducibly complex systems and so forth, point in the direction of teleology or design. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I want to kind of stand in solidarity with you too, Overprotected Atheist. Like, I am not science whatsoever. Like, I have absolutely no clue on this stuff. I think just one thing that stood out to me in what you're saying, more from a philosophical perspective, is looking at sort of the evolutionary history and saying, oh, this could have been done way better. I think in order to say that, I have to kind of hop into God's all-knowingness and say, hey, like I could see a way better way for this to go. But I think on the Christian worldview that there's a lot of options there of, and actually it's to be expected that we don't fully understand, like if God really is working out all these omnipotent, omniscient purposes, and we find out he's been doing it for billions of years now, I think it makes sense from the perspective that I'm given from the Christian worldview of just being a human in light of this God working everything out, that I would look at the evolutionary process and be like, why do I have an appendix? Like, this is stupid. I think that would be expected. And I would just push back a little bit on assuming that we can say there's a better way. Because I think in order to do that, I have to almost step into this all-knowing way and kind of disconnect evolution from the rest of history and see what other things could have been done by these things that maybe with my limited scope don't make sense. But from God's perspective, I guess could have purposes that we're not seeing, if that makes sense. And I know that's frustrating. Trust me, it makes me very uncomfortable. And it was something I tried to run from for a while, and trying to kind of figuring out my Christianity is the fact that Christianity promises the question marks makes me so uncomfortable. Like, I can't even tell you. So I want to sympathize with that right off the bat. Because even when I'm hearing myself say my answer, I'm like, oh, but that sucks.
Right, and I think that I think that the argument from suboptimal design, which Overprotected Atheist was putting forward earlier, I think that is akin to a God of the gaps argument, except you might call it a Darwin of the gaps argument, where we can't explain why a designer might have done it that way. Therefore, we'll just plug in Darwin to explain that of which we're ignorant. And then as science advances, then the gaps in our knowledge about the reason that things are designed the way they are shrinks. And so that argument in turn has to retreat with each new advance in scientific discovery. And actually, for many of these systems that have been said in times past to be suboptimally designed, it's turned out in the course of scientific research that actually they do have a reason why they're designed the way that they are. And so I'd be cautious about wielding that argument. And even if it is the case that it's improbable that certain systems are designed the way they are on the hypothesis of design, in my opinion, it would be far more improbable that they would be the way that they are on the falsehood of design, because of the numerous examples of complex adaptations that would be required to bring them about. Anything to comment on that, either of you?
I don't know.
I think it's super interesting, and it's definitely something that I will be learning more about for sure. And I'm sure Overprotected Atheist relates to me on that.
Yeah.
But I would say right now, this is definitely one of my outer elements. I definitely feel a little more comfortable in the historical and philosophical side of things, and I think you feel that as well. Yeah.
Well, one other thing about Adam and Eve, before I forget. So if you the key objection that's often made to Adam and Eve is that on an evolutionary paradigm, which embraces gradualism. There's never any first human as such, right? It's all on a continuum, in the same way that there's no day on which you become an adult. We could say it's your 18th birthday, but that's rather arbitrary. And likewise, it's very difficult to quantify how many facial hairs it takes to qualify as a beard. It's a continuum. And likewise with Adam and Eve, there's on the evolutionary paradigm, there's no first human as such, right? But I think that if you move away from gradualism and embrace a more teleological approach or a saltationist approach, where you can have sudden infusions of information to the biosphere, like I proposed, then that problem, I think, dissolves. The population genetics arguments against an historical Adam and Eve have been shown to be incorrect. If you're prepared to place Adam and Eve back into the hundreds of thousands of years and propose created diversity, then, as Anne Yeager and Ola Hostier, population geneticist, has shown, it's quite plausible to have an historical Adam and Eve, to have all of humanity descended from a primordial couple. So I'm not so sure that the evidence has ruled out an historical Adam and Eve. And even if it had ruled out a primordial couple, I think that a very reasonable fallback position would be that Adam and Eve were created among the first human population, and you could adopt a kind of a tribal representative view where they represent the initial founding population as the first king and queen or priest and priestess of humanity, which I think is also a view that would be a reasonable and defensible and plausible. And therefore, I don't think that is a very robust objection to Christianity. Any comment on that?
I think because I came from a fundamentalist background, it very much, I don't know, like the whole idea that they had to have the fall in order for Jesus to come was the biggest thing. Is like, because if there is, even if they're just, through evolution that they eventually come, that doesn't make that story in the Bible true either. Like them being in the garden and, having the fruit and disobeying God, because once again, we don't have any way of knowing that is something that actually happened. And for me, if those things did not happen in reality, then there's no reason for Jesus to come, because he's the second Adam and he's supposed to undo everything that Adam and Eve did in the garden. So without that foundation, the whole thing, in my opinion, because of what I have looked into and what I was taught, it falls apart. Because regardless if they existed or not, it doesn't make that story true. And the whole point of Christianity is that story had to be true in order for Jesus to undo what they did, because they allowed sin into the world, and Jesus came to take that sin out of the world. So for me, evolution just shows me that story can't be literal, and because it's not literal, the whole thing falls apart. So the dominoes all fall.
Actually, Jonathan, I have I guess an objection to what you were saying that I'd want to hear your thoughts about is, if getting away from a fundamentalist perspective and hopping into a Christianity that can embrace some sort of evolution, what would that mean for Jesus's genealogies that come back to Adam, or the one genealogy that goes back to Adam, I believe?
Was that was addressed to me?
Yeah, sorry.
So I think that a robust historical Adam and Eve is important for the truth of Christianity. So I would agree with that premise that Overprotected Atheist is giving us. I would just disagree with the other premise that it's not in fact true. So I don't think that there's any direct evidence that bears on Adam and Eve existing, but I think that you can argue indirectly from the testimony of Jesus. So you can argue that Jesus is the divine Son of God, Israel's Messiah, who rose from the dead, and therefore that grants credibility to his statements. And since Jesus obviously affirmed an historical Adam and Eve, that therefore provides a rational justification for us as Christians to also adopt an historical Adam and Eve, even without direct evidence. We can have indirect evidence. So that's the way that I would approach it.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but I don't think that the scientific evidence rules out an historical Adam and Eve at all. So I don't see that as a particularly potent objection.
So they'd be like the kind of what you're talking about, the sudden emergence of a new species. Is that kind of where you would categorize
humans coming up and that being where Adam and Eve is.
Yeah, I think that Adam and Eve were specially created by God, correct? And I think that I think it's a plausible scenario that the God even perhaps used a genome of a non-human animal as a template for this new form of life. I do have a problem with that theologically or scientifically. Either way, I think that Adam and Eve were specially created, and all humanity is descended from that primordial couple.
Huh. I've never heard that before. That's super interesting.
Mm-hmm. Overprotected Atheist, any questions for either of us? Or
I don't think so. I'm enjoying this conversation though.
Yeah, I'm glad. Jonathan, you'll have to have us do another one of these.
Are you good to go for a little bit longer, or do you want to wrap up around now? Or
I'm good. I'm good to keep going.
You're gonna keep going. He's like, I want to go.
No, not. Trust me, I got homework. This is
okay.
this
oh
is
yeah,
way,
you're in college,
sorry.
huh?
Jonathan's a professor. Jonathan's a professor. I got to be careful what I say around him. But
not your professor. So.
No, I'm good to keep talking. Overprotected Atheist, are you?
If you need to go, that's
yeah,
totally.
I was gonna say I have stuff to do. So
okay, sure.
But yeah.
You're gonna make me do my homework?
Yes, do your homework. I'm a mom. I know how this works.
I know I'm outnumbered here. I got a professor and a mom.
All right. Well, we can finish here then. But thanks so much, Overprotected Atheist, for
thank you.
on. And it's been a joy talking with you. And I'm sure we'll keep in touch. All right. Well, have a great rest of your evening, everyone, on the live stream. And I'll sign off here, and I'll see you all at the next one. Okay.